Hello.
Hello, 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 Ashraf. Thank you. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this session. Today we're going to be speaking on elevating your skills, clear intro of tools and tech to learn next. So, our speaker for today is Ashraf Abed. Did I get that correct? Ashraf Abed. So Ashraf is the founder and lead, I believe, of Debug Academy, based out of Washington.
Yep.
And he is also a certified Drupal Grandmaster. Wow. So I'm excited. And just before I get him, I bring him on stage to do his presentation. Um, if you got any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll have some time at the end of this, and we'll just run through the questions. Also, I'd like to remind everyone, Drupal Camp Asheville has our code of conduct to make the event enjoyable to everyone. So let's remember that. Without further ado, over to you, Ashraf.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay. Hello, everyone. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Looks like I do have the option. All right. Looks like it's working. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so like Ken said, we're going to be talking about elevating your skills, essentially what to learn next. Now, teaching is a very big part of what I do. I teach Drupal, I teach React, I teach, PHP and Symfony, and as well as some basic programming languages. And I put this talk together because I think a lot of people just need an introduction to the tools and technologies to just understand at a very high level what the options are before you even commit to learning something new. So yes, I run Debug Academy. We do all our teaching online these days. I'll throw a link in the chat. For anyone interested, feel free to sign up for our newsletter so you can hear about what we're teaching and when we're teaching it. Now, this talk is primarily geared towards people who you could say are not yet, or at least don't yet think of themselves as developers. In the Drupal realm, we have this role called the site builder, and the site builder refers to people who may or may not know HTML and CSS, may be comfortable with configuring or selecting modules or themes, and may be comfortable with changing the settings on a Drupal website, but maybe less comfortable writing code, right? So you might not be comfortable with Sass, Twig, PHP. You may not be comfortable with using the command line with Git or Composer and so on. And those are all skills that you might need to work as a Drupal developer. But again, nowadays, you might wonder, which should I learn first? What's the difference between them? And so on. Right, so I'm a site builder or I'm a content editor, and I want to invest in leveling up. And there are just so many options these days. There's Drupal 8, there's Drupal 9, there's Drupal 10, there's Backdrop. There's some Backdrop talks at this conference, actually. And, underneath those that I just mentioned, there are a number of programming languages like PHP, Twig, Sass, CSS, and more. But even outside of Drupal altogether, there are JavaScript frameworks. There's React.js, VueJS, Svelte. There's more frameworks, Gatsby.js. Depending on which circles you frequent, you might hear people talking about Tailwind. maybe about something called Laravel or Symfony, or even Ruby on Rails. If it sounds like I'm just throwing out jargon and buzzwords, it's intentional. I don't expect you to understand the names of everything I'm mentioning. But there are also career paths that don't involve continuing to become a developer. You can get involved in maybe technical documentation. You could become Scrum certified, and you could get into DevOps and learn Docker. You could even explore the blockchain. So with so many options, how can you make a decision? And everybody has their biases. I have mine, right? I teach Drupal, I teach React, so my bias is going to be somewhere in that area. So I tried to put together some metrics for evaluating all the options that are out there. And the metrics I chose are ones that I think are most important to people who are learning for the sake of an investment, right? So those metrics include how difficult it is to learn, how many jobs there are, or how easy it is to get a job, what the entry-level salary looks like, and how helpful is the community? Is there a community, and how helpful is it? Okay, so let's talk about some of the options that are available. And feel free to post questions in the chat. I'll glance occasionally, and also I'll look at the Q&A towards the end. Now, I rattled off a number of options, and I have to be clear here. We are not going to talk about all of the options. We're going to prioritize options that have some sort of overlap with Drupal, right? So options where your experience in Drupal will be looked at favorably. So that'll, for example, eliminate blockchain right off the bat. People are not going to say, okay, you did site building with Drupal, you're ready for the blockchain. Whereas they might say, okay, you worked with Drupal, maybe you're ready, maybe you're closer to a themer position. Right, so we're looking for technologies where your skills will transfer and employers will look upon your experience favorably. Okay, and again, there are so many options that we have to sort of group them into categories. So let's talk a bit about the programming languages. Now, first of all, if you haven't learned a programming language before, it's important to sort of get an idea of, how do you think about programming languages? And programming languages are a lot like natural languages, right? So if I want to learn a different language, just a different natural language, there are different levels of learning it. If I speak English and I want to learn German, I have to learn the vocabulary, I have to learn the grammar, etc. But there are some differences between learning a programming language and learning a spoken or written natural language. And one of the primary differences is programming languages have very limited vocabularies. So what I mean by that is programming languages, instead of having thousands of words, might only have hundreds of words. And they might only have, 20 to 50 words that you use regularly. Programming languages are very explicit, and they never imply anything. So when you're learning a new language, I remember I at one point in my life, I went to Barcelona for a Drupal conference, and I do not speak Spanish, but I was able to get by using body language, maybe using a couple of words here and there, gesturing, and that was adequate. But in software, there is no body language. So if you use the wrong word or you leave something out, the script won't work, right? So learning a programming language is like learning a regular language, except the language has no body language and the vocabulary is more limited. So to be a programmer is to translate from business requirements or natural language to one of those programming languages. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about some of the programming languages. So HTML is the one that you would typically learn first. It looks like what you see here on the right. The vocabulary in HTML consists of elements on the page. So for example, we see H1, an opening H1 and a closing H1. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer out. There we go. That's better. Okay, so the H1 over here, that's referred to as a header, a first or primary header. If there was an H2, that would be a child header. Inside of that, we see a P for paragraph. And basically, when I put an H1 for a header, I get big header text. When I put a P for a paragraph, I can write words in a paragraph, right? So HTML is a good first language to learn. Now, with these programming languages, I like to include who understands the language and who it's understood by and what it understands. So what I mean by that is when you write a programming language, sometimes it's a one-way conversation and sometimes it's a two-way conversation. Okay, so when I write HTML, it's understood by web browsers. So that would be Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari. Those are all the consumers of the language. They're the ones who listen to the language and interpret what I'm saying. And it's a one-way conversation, right? So I can't send information back and forth. I just give the information once, it listens to it, and that's the end of the conversation. But why is this important? It's important because the fact that it's understood by Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and so on means when you speak in the language, you have to keep in mind all those different audiences. So what do I mean by that? Let's go back to natural language for a moment. If I speak English and I'm talking to someone raised in the US, they'll understand what I say one way. If I talk to someone raised in the West Coast of the US, they might understand what I say one way, and someone raised in the East Coast of the US might understand it differently. As an example, if you ask someone, how are you, and they're raised in the US, they'll probably just give you a one-word answer like good or fine. But if you talk to someone in Europe and you say, how are you, they will typically actually tell you how they are, because that's what they understood that question to mean, right? I had some friends in college raised in Germany. Anytime you ask them how they are, they give you, a lot of information about how they're feeling. And that's just how they understood the question. So with programming languages, just like natural languages, you have to understand who you're talking to, because each person you're talking to or each platform might understand what you're saying differently. So I might write HTML and give it to Firefox and Chrome, and Firefox might make the H1 font size 20, and Chrome might make the H1 font size 16. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but just things to be aware of. Now, back to our metrics for deciding what to learn next. HTML gets the highest score for relative ease of learning. It's going to be easier to learn HTML than PHP or React. But the job availability is the lowest. If you know HTML and you go out looking for a job saying HTML is the primary skill you can offer, you're going to have a hard time finding a job. If you do find a job, HTML alone is not going to cause you to have a very high salary. in terms of community, which I labeled helping hands, there's a very, very large community of people who know HTML and who are willing to help. There is also a very significant amount of learning material out there for HTML. So ease of learning and community-wise, it's unmatched. Now on to the next one, CSS. So CSS looks like what you see on the right. It allows you to essentially, oversimplified a bit, it allows you to style the content on your page. Okay, and it's understood by web browsers again, meaning I can write CSS to Chrome and to Firefox and to Safari, and they each might interpret it a little differently than one another. But the CSS actually sort of listens back. It understands some interactions from users. So if the user were to hover over a link, you can use CSS to react to that hover and to change the color. So it's a limited two-way conversation. Right? You send your CSS to the browser, it does the styling, but the CSS also listens for interactions from the user. Now, CSS is a bit harder to learn than HTML. Relatively speaking, it's still easier than other languages. And when I say it's easy to learn, this is one that people might disagree on with CSS, because a lot of senior developers will tell you CSS is hard. And they're not wrong. But when I say it's relatively easy to learn, I don't mean it's relatively easy to become an expert. I mean it's relatively easy to know enough to use it on the job. So it's relatively easy to learn, and there's a big community of people ready to help. It's still very hard to get a job with only CSS and HTML. And maybe the job will pay a bit more than HTML, but it still will not be something that you are, it's not going to be very high, basically. So HTML and CSS are sort of the basic languages that any web development platform would use. Whether you use Drupal, React, or anything else to make a website, you're going to need to know HTML and CSS. With that said, HTML and CSS are not enough on their own, typically, for you to get a job as a developer. Another language is PHP. Most of Drupal is written using PHP. It's a server-side language. So what does that mean? It means you're not writing PHP for the browsers. You're not writing it for Google Chrome and Firefox. You're writing it for a server, which is something running behind the scenes where you host your website. And so when you write your PHP code, let's say you host your website on Acquia or Pantheon. They're the ones who would have the servers. And you write your PHP code, as long as your server understands it, then it's universally understood to all of your users, because your users, they actually don't receive PHP at the end of the day. They get the output of the PHP. They receive HTML, CSS. But behind the scenes, you do the work in PHP. And in this example you see here on the right, we have this function that says display content, and it just passes this HTML and it prints it out. There's a print statement here. It's not the most practical example. It's just meant to be easy to understand. But this is some PHP code which prints out some HTML code. And PHP is a much more involved language. It has the ability to handle non-trivial data types. PHP, the language, can talk to the server and find out what time is it? What's the time zone of the user visiting? What cookies does the user have in their browser? Are they logged into the website? PHP runs one line at a time, waiting for the previous line to finish before starting the next line. And it has a lot of pre-named code that you can leverage. So you don't have to write everything from scratch. PHP is harder to learn. It can be quite difficult if it's your first programming language. This is still a relative scale, relative difficulty of learning. So if you're just learning PHP, I gave it a score of 6. We do teach PHP at Debug Academy. We have a 2-week course where we introduce you to PHP. Ease of landing a role. Remember, with HTML, I gave it 1 out of 10. With PHP, I'm giving it 6 out of 10. If you get fairly comfortable with PHP, it's not a 9 out of 10, right? It's not easy to get a job, but it's a strong selling point. And part of the reason for that is because fewer code schools teach PHP, right? Something like React is more popular, or JavaScript is more popular than PHP these days, which has an interesting dynamic in the job market, because there are definitely more JavaScript jobs, but everybody's learning JavaScript, so it's actually still very competitive. Whereas in PHP, there are fewer PHP jobs, but there are much less applicants to PHP jobs as well. So even though there are fewer jobs available, a lot of times it's easier to land a job because of the lack of competition. So it's an interesting dynamic. The base salary is a good amount higher than it might be for something like CSS or even site building. It's harder to land the job, but if you do land it, due to your PHP proficiency, you can do fairly well with the salary. And in terms of the community aspect, the PHP community, it's not quite as large, or at least you won't find it everywhere like you might find with JavaScript or HTML or CSS. With those other ones, you might pop onto Twitter and say, hey, I'm struggling with this problem, can someone help me? And you'll get a lot of answers. With PHP, if you go into your local general tech community, you'll find less people talking about PHP. Okay, now JavaScript is another programming language. Drupal actually does use JavaScript, but JavaScript, it's similar to PHP in some ways. It can deal with non-trivial data types, but it does not talk to a server. It actually talks to the browser. So it talks to Google Chrome, it talks to Firefox, meaning if you write JavaScript code, you have to make sure that each of the browsers is understanding it the way you intended. Let's see here. JavaScript is similar in difficulty to PHP in terms of learning it. What helps it out is that because it runs in your browser, you don't actually need to download any fancy tools. You don't need to get a server. You can just start writing JavaScript right in your browser and testing it out right away. In terms of ease of landing an entry role, I actually gave it a lower score than PHP. It's more difficult to land an entry-level JavaScript role than an entry-level PHP role. Some people might disagree with me on this, but there are definitely more JavaScript roles available. But there is a huge influx of junior JavaScript developers from coding boot camps, around the world, really. And so when someone posts an entry-level JavaScript job, they will sometimes get hundreds of applications. Whereas if someone posts an entry-level PHP job, they might get 5, 10 applications. So that's why I say it's easier to land a job in PHP as a junior developer. But the expected base salary is higher for JavaScript. So if you are able to take that step and break through that first level and get your foot in the door, I would expect your starting salary to be higher. Potentially long term, the salary, for senior developers, it's probably somewhat similar, but I think there's a higher earning potential in the JavaScript community. In terms of helping hands, the JavaScript community is very helpful. There's obviously different components to it. Some of it is toxic and whatnot. I should say it's very large, right? So you can find people who are helpful, and there's a lot of learning material out there and whatnot. Okay, so that's JavaScript. Twig is another language which is used in Drupal for the front end. It looks like this. So you can print out a value and then you can transform it using one of these filters, the capitalize filter. Twig is understood by web servers just like PHP because Twig is a front-end language for PHP. It's meant to make writing front-end, writing HTML in a PHP project easier. Okay, so Twig is pretty high on the ease of learning chart. It's actually, it's probably easier than CSS to learn. It's very similar to HTML, but it's very difficult to land an entry-level job with Twig. So if you're looking to land a job, I would not be spending too much time on Twig for that purpose. The base salary, if you do land a job, can be reasonable, and the community, again, is okay. Let me see. Okay, so here's the summary. It includes this summary includes some that we haven't gotten to yet, but I figure, at some point people are going to start losing focus, and so I'll jump to the summary and then jump back to individual items. So just adding up those scores that I put together on the previous slides as well as some upcoming slides. Let's see. We get Drupal gets a score of 31, so the way this is ranked is a higher score means it's easier to get your first job. The path to getting your first job or your first promotion is easier. Now, with what we've talked about so far, HTML, CSS, they both got a score of 23. PHP edged them out slightly, getting a score of 24 because it's harder to learn, which hurts its score, but it's easier to get a job, and if you get a job, it would pay better, which helps its score. JavaScript beats out PHP. It's got a better community. It's harder to get a job, but the better community and the ease of learning JavaScript play in its favor. Twig gets a lower score than JavaScript. Drupal 8 got a score of 31, and React gets a score of 28. Again, this is geared towards people who are becoming developers for the first time. These scores might be different if you're a senior developer and you're looking to learn this, you're looking to pivot. Okay, so essentially, like I said, I'm biased, but sometimes I wonder, I teach programming, and it's really important to me that the people I teach get value out of what I'm doing. And so I always reevaluate, should I still be teaching Drupal? But when I look at these metrics and I look at the performance of people that I teach, I consistently see those who are learning Drupal are having an easier time getting their first job. And once they get their first job, they're sticking with Drupal. Whereas those who learn React as junior developers, sometimes they're doing side projects for, a year and a half or 2 years, just for someone to give them a chance on a project. So in my experience, it's easier to get your foot in the door with Drupal. So I talked about programming languages. There are also frameworks, and frameworks are a collection of pre-written code, which also dictates how your project should be built to an extent. Okay, so a framework comes with pre-written code, project structure, a lot of the common scenarios already built out for you. Most of the code that is common across projects already written for you. And Drupal is an example of a framework. So here are some of the frameworks. Specializing in a framework always helps you get hired, because your employer is typically going to use frameworks. They're typically not going to build from scratch. So in CSS, there are Tailwind, CSS, Bootstrap, and others. In JavaScript, there's React, Vue, Gatsby, Svelte. In PHP, there's Drupal, Symfony, Laravel, Backdrop, and more. These are all different frameworks you could learn. In the PHP realm, there's Drupal and Backdrop. The nice thing about both of them is they are low code. You don't have to code for building the majority of your project. A lot of your project can be built using the user interface, clicking and configuring options. Drupal's strengths include structured data, their design layer, Twig, their integration with another PHP framework, Symfony, enterprise level caching, and it's used by large organizations, and government or agencies still use it for new projects. Backdrop is a fork of Drupal, which means Drupal was copy and pasted and renamed as Backdrop and then adjusted. It has some of the same strengths as Drupal, like structured data, displaying a solid display architecture. Where Backdrop might beat Drupal is it's easier to learn and get started, for sure. And the community it's not that the people are necessarily, more welcoming, but I'd say there's a much stronger emphasis in their community on making things easy for newcomers. Whereas in Drupal, sometimes the focus is more heavily weighted towards the architecture of Drupal itself. So things to keep in mind. But with Backdrop, I think Backdrop community is a lot smaller, and there's more work available for Drupal. Now, with Drupal, ease of learning, a lot of people would give Drupal's ease of learning a score of something like 2. And I put an asterisk here. I give it an ease of learning of 8. I'd say it's very easy to learn if you go through a program like Debug Academies, because we're on our 17th semester right now, and we've got it down to a science. We walk you through everything. So if you go through a program like that, it's pretty easy to learn. If you teach it to yourself, it can be quite difficult. But you can use that to your advantage, because if you do learn Drupal, there are not many other people who learn Drupal and teach it to themselves. So it's actually much easier to get an entry-level Drupal job. And again, this is assuming you learned Drupal development, including command line, Git, Composer, Twig, Sass, and so on. Some PHP and module development. The base salary can be relatively high, and the Drupal community is very helpful. So we have the Drupal community. If you go through our course, you also have the Debug Academy community. And overall, there are a lot of people who want you to succeed. In PHP, the wider PHP ecosystem, there is Symfony and Laravel, built using PHP or written using PHP, just like Drupal. But the difference is that Drupal lets you do a lot of the site building without writing code, whereas Symfony and Laravel, you're going to be writing code for everything you do. Regardless of whether it's Drupal or Symfony or Laravel, you should be comfortable with the command line, with Git, with Composer, with HTML, CSS. You should be comfortable with Sass. And sometimes, some projects also integrate React.js or Vue. Others will stick with Twig. So the basic out-of-the-box Drupal will be Twig. Decoupled Drupal, if you heard of it, some more advanced projects will sometimes use React. Okay. And if you want to branch out of Drupal entirely, you can focus on React.js or VueJS or other JavaScript frameworks. These ones, a lot of people really like them, and they're kind of fun to use in some ways. You are writing code the whole time. It's not a click and configure type of thing. But for React, for example, it's got a very large community. There's a lot of add-on packages, which are like the modules in Drupal, and lots of jobs out there. The downside, there are a lot of junior developers competing for their first job. Vue.js is somewhat similar to React. It's a little easier to learn. A lot of people really like it, but there are fewer jobs. People will often build projects using PHP Laravel for the backend and Vue.js for the front end. And that's also a nice, appealing combination for employers. So for React, the ease of learning, I give it a score of a 7. It's fairly high, relatively speaking, because there's so much good training. The React website has such great documentation. Ease of landing your entry-level role is 4, which is relatively low because there's so much competition. The base salary can be very high, and the community can be very helpful. Okay, so remember I compared the scores of these different technologies, and I had Drupal beating out React, but most of the React scores are higher than Drupal. It's specifically the ease of landing your first job that hurts React as the technology of choice for beginner developers. So sometimes I'll have people who are interested in React, and I will tell them, use Drupal to get your foot in the door, and if you don't like Drupal, then switch to React. And they tend to just stick with Drupal when they do that. And you could just take it a step further and go out of web development altogether. You can look at DevOps. That's things like Docker, Kubernetes, Ansible, other buzzwords you may or may not have heard. The tricky thing with the DevOps role, it's difficult to land an entry-level position because it's such an important, it's the infrastructure for your website. So if you're doing that work, you're expected to make sure your website doesn't crash, basically. And a lot of employers don't trust entry-level developers with that type of work, unfortunately. So it's difficult to get started if you don't have experience. So typically what happens is a mid-level or senior web developer will start dabbling in DevOps and then make the switch. But it's a little harder for someone with no experience to go straight to doing DevOps and to get a full-time job in that role. So you typically need a degree in computer science or a lot of experience as a software developer to land a DevOps role. But if you get that, DevOps engineers are very highly in demand and they're paid quite a lot. There are also some less technical roles like technical documentation or project management, Scrum, Agile, etc. And for technical documentation, you should be typically has a requirement of being fluent in English. You must be a very clear communicator, good writer, and have some understanding of the technical side of things, at least enough to write about it. On the project management side, the salary is actually quite good for project managers in software. And it's a different set of skills that you need to do that role. Okay. Now, how do you learn all of these technologies I've been talking about? There are a number of online learning resources. There's codeacademy.com. This is an option that has some free choices. So it's great to get started with HTML and CSS on codeacademy.com. There is free Code Camp. They have a lot of free tutorials and such. And they teach you a lot about HTML, CSS, and React for free. W3 Schools also, in some circles, has a bad rep, but it's actually not bad. And it does teach you HTML, CSS also for free. And there's YouTube, which has many videos with tutorials, and there's also Drupalize Me, which has a lot of videos about Drupal. There's also Drupal.tv, which has videos from conferences like this one. So you can go to Drupal.tv and search a topic and find videos from all sorts of Drupal conferences where where you can find sessions again like this one. And finally, you can work with us at debugacademy.com. We primarily deliver live training, and we do it using a real project and very small groups. So if you want to learn with a cohort of about 8 students, I typically teach our courses. Some of them are 1 day, some of them are 3 months, and they're often 2-3 hour sessions per week. I'll give you a link to one of them in the chat. So for courses like the one I linked to in the chat, we teach Drupal, HTML, CSS, Sass, the command line, Git, a little bit of Docker, Composer, Twig, PHP, module development. We teach it part-time, 2-3 hour classes per week over a period of about 12 weeks. So twice a week for 12 weeks. And it's typically not in US working hours. So this is something people can go through to switch their careers and become Drupal developers without quitting their day job. That's something we run 3 times a year, and the next one will be in September. Best thing about that is that we build a real project in class. So every semester, we have a designer build a new project, and our students build it out, and ultimately we have a goal of contributing it to the Drupal community. So it's not reusing projects each semester. Let's see, you can
Great. Ashraf, I am conscious of time.
Yeah, and this is I think that was the last slide really. Yep, feel free to follow me on Twitter or visit our website. And if you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask about, feel free to do so now.
Excellent. Thank you very, very, very much, Ashraf. Loads of insights there, loads of things to take away. I'm not seeing any questions in chat. But being we're out of time, I'm just gonna ask everyone to take a note of your details. Debugacademy.com. I'm sure everyone can reach you through that and through Twitter. Is that correct?
Yes, of course.
Excellent, excellent. So just before we jump off, I'm just gonna share my screen. We've got we'll take a short break after this and then come back at 3 p.m. for some lovely sessions, building a mindset for technical leadership. There's one on idea to action, how to turn your passion into a Drupal community project, and rebuilding the college website during a pandemic, a journey of discovery. I mean, all three sound excellent. I had to choose, but I'm sure you'll join us for that. So just before I leave, I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Ashraf for the lovely presentation. Round of applause for Ashraf. And thank you everyone who joined us. Thank you very much. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.